Class. So here we are once again, as we say every single time, with our philosophy of religion class, right? Now, what we're going to be looking at today is an Aristotelian. This is kind of a surprise here, right? Because I had said we were just going to look at this Aristotelian version of a cosmological argument. But actually, we're going to combine something here and we're going to look at not only an Aristotelian version of the teleological argument, but we're actually going to look at one of well, not one of, but the classical version of the teleological argument. Now, I think this is going to be very interesting because, again, we're looking at these classical versions of different arguments. The first being an Aristotelian version of a cosmological type argument, and the second being a classical version in the vein of Aquinas of his teleological argument. Now, you're not seeing me right now on the screen. That's fine. That's okay because I've actually got a different idea in mind for today. I'm going to pull up a presentation of the teleological argument. So you'll see me in just a moment there. But before we get to that, I want to look at this version of an Aristotelian type argument for the existence of God. Now, some of you may have heard of this type of argument in the language or using the vernacular of an unmoved mover, or well, let me say this. I'll hold off for that for a second. But basically, this unmoved mover type of argument. Now, Aquinas does use this argument as well, but we're going to specifically look at this Aristotelian version because we know that Aquinas was something of an Aristotelian, right? He followed in the school of thought of Aristotle, specifically his metaphysics and understanding of epistemology, even though it wouldn't have technically been called epistemology back in the day, just kind of a subdivision of metaphysics. Now, we're going to look at this because a lot of people think that this argument is there's nothing here to offer, but this is just completely untrue, as made note by, as you see here, Dr. Ed Fazer at Pasadena City College. He's popularized these arguments once again. Well, I shouldn't say that he's done it, but he's helped to bring this about to a more popular, back into a place of prominence, so to speak, in modern philosophy, even though there have been thinkers that have carried these versions of the arguments, this argument throughout the centuries, right? Even up into the modern day, he just tends to get the spotlight in regards to these arguments. Now, again, just so you remember, right? Just so you just to recall that these arguments, that even this today, this unmoved mover argument, this classical argument will not be. It's not deemed debunked or undone just simply because it's old. You can easily replace, as we mentioned last lecture, the outdated scientific examples, right? You can use modern scientific examples to prove the same argument, right? To run the same argument. Now, this whole thing about change here, I don't want you to think of unmoved mover as just simply physical goings on about, right? It's any type of change at all. So it's really, when Aristotle says unmoved mover, what he's really implying is an unchanged changer. Unchanged changer, not simply something that goes from one, he's not concerned with locomotion, so to speak, something going from one locale to another locale, even though that is also an instance of change. But more fundamentally, he's talking about change in general, things going from one state of affairs to another state of affairs. Now, in order to look at this argument, we're going to have to unpack just a little bit of metaphysics, right? There's a little metaphysical baggage that's involved with these classical arguments. Now, when we talk about metaphysics, we're talking simply about what is, right? Usually metaphysics is even looked at, or it's just a subdivision of philosophy, meaning it's just a study of what is real, right? What actually is, what is actually real. In fact, modern day philosophers usually would call this something like ontology, right? Ontology is the same thing, right? The study of being, that which is, that what is being, the study of being qua being, right? So what is. Now, I'm not going to really elaborate on these first 2 points here, for causes and form and matter, because the teleological argument that you're about to view in a few minutes after this, that's going to go more into that to help explain a bit more of that process, or a bit more of what that means to say that there are 4 causes for all that comes into existence, and it's going to go into also a bit more about what it means to exist as a composite of form and matter. These are metaphysical principles. So where I have underlined here in our slide, this act and potency, herein is our argument. This is where our argument about this unchanged changer is really going to come into play, this understanding of act and potency. Now, when I say act and potency, when Aristotle would say something like, or Aquinas would say something like act and potency, what they mean to say, that's just philosophical jargon for actuality and potentiality. So essentially, before we get to that, let me stay here for a second. Let's camp out here for a second with actuality and potentiality. When we talk about actuality and potentiality, what we mean to say is this, that everything that exists either exists in a state of pure actuality, a state of potentiality, or a composite of both actuality and potentiality. If something really does have existence, if something exists, right? Again, we're talking about metaphysics. What is real? What is being, right? The study of being. Everything that exists is either going to exist in one of these possibilities. It's either going to be purely actual, it's going to be potential, or it's going to be a composite of both actuality and potentiality. All right, so we're already getting neck deep, right, in philosophy. Now, you can also see why these classical philosophical arguments are so forgotten, because there is so much philosophy here, right? This isn't simply just pointing at things and going on with some easy sort of lay understanding of terms and definitions and whatnot. We're getting into deep philosophy, right? We're getting into metaphysics already. So let's go ahead and start to look a bit at this argument, right? Just kind of keeping these things in mind. I know this is a lot right now. You can go back, listen to the lecture again if you need to, or don't worry, don't try to digest every bit of chunk now that's being tossed out. Simply just follow the lecture, right? And things will start to fall into place, right? So let's look at this. Taking Phaser's lead here. Let me just read it out to you first. Whatever is moved from a potential state must be acted upon by something that is actual. This cannot go on ad infinitum, as there would be no explanation as to why anything is changing now, or we should even say why anything is actualized now. So something must be pure act, right, or pure actuality. There must be an unmoved mover, an unchanging changer, etc. Now, when we say, right, that whatever is moved from potential state must be acted upon by something that is actual, this goes back to how things exist, right? So, in the history of philosophy, remember you had the classical philosopher Parmenides that said, look, change is really just an illusion. Because for something to change, it would have to actualize itself. It would have to go from one state of being to another state of being. But we know that if something doesn't exist, right? If something is not what it is, well, then it just is not, right? It doesn't exist. But things that don't exist can't simply make themselves exist, because out of nothing, nothing comes. So any sort of change really must be an illusion, right? This was also his disciple Zeno, one of his paradoxes, right? That change must be an illusion. But Aristotle comes along and he's like, well, wait a minute. No, things do exist. And we know that change really does happen, right? Just by an observation of the natural world, right? So the fact that we know that change actually happens, there has to be some sort of account for that. We have to know that change really is happening, we do know that change really is happening. So how do we account for it? So Aristotle says there has to be some sort of middle ground between something existing and something not existing. Something that is real and something just not being real at all. Aristotle says there must be some sort of middle ground there. So Aristotle's middle ground is that some things exist as potentialities, right? Meaning that, to use Phaser's example, a banana may not be yellow, but we know that it exists potentially as yellow, right? Or a banana may exist as a solid, but we know that it potentially exists as a smushed up liquid, right? Given the right circumstance of a blender or your foot or whatever the case may be. So it exists, it's actualized in one state. It's actualized as a solid banana, but it potentially exists as a smushed up banana, right? Or a chopped up banana, or a green banana, or a yellow banana, or a completely brown, dotted, whatever, completely just rotten, ripe banana. So there is a way that things exist, but there is a way that they could or potentially exist, right? And so for something to go from one state of affairs, right, from an actual state or from a potential state to an actual state, something has to move that to that particular state, right? Bananas can't do that to itself, right? So something has to actualize potential states of affairs, right? Now, this can't go on ad infinitum, right? If something's just moving this, which moves this, which moves this, which changes this, which changes this, which changes this, well, then nothing would ever get changed right now. So Aristotle's, his example of this is, imagine that there is a rock on the ground, and imagine that there is a stick moving the rock, but imagine that what is moving the stick is my hand, right? So my hand is moving the stick, is moving the rock. Now, suppose that my hand were to stop moving, right? Were to stop changing, right? That state of affairs there. Well, it's not as if I stop moving my hand, the rock continues to move, right? No. Something has to move the stick, which happens to be moving the rock. But if I stop my hand, well, then the entire process stops, period, right? The rock will no longer move, even if, or simply because nothing is moving the stick, which is not moving, my hand, and so on and so forth. So something must be continually moving, or there's going to be nothing to account why anything is moving at all. And let me actually rephrase that. There must be something that is moving all of, or changing all of, or actualizing all states of affairs, or there's not going to be anything that's actualized right here and right now. So let's go into this in a little more in depth. That's the basic outline, so to speak. Now let's go into that in a little more depth here. We know that change is a real feature of the world, right? But we know that change is the actualization of a potential. So the actualization of a potential is a real feature of the world, right? Now, again, we know that no potential can be actualized unless something already actual actualizes it, right? This is just the principle of causality, right? This is just we know that things have to have a cause, right? That things don't just happen willy-nilly, uncaused, out of nothing, right? Now, I want you to imagine a flag here. Imagine a flag, look out your window and there's a pole and there's a flag, right? Well, that flag exists in some actual state of affairs. It's right there hanging on the pole, right? Now, it could potentially exist as a flag that's flapping in the wind, right? It could be flapping in the wind That's a potential state in which it could be, but we know that it's not right now. Now, can the flag actualize itself into a flapping state? Can it start to move and blow around? Can it do that itself? No. It depends upon something actual for it to be moved from the potential state of hanging there to the actual state of flapping, right, or blowing in the breeze, right? Well, what does that? Well, the flag itself cannot account for itself moving from its potential state of hanging there to an actual state of blowing or flapping in the breeze. So what does that then? Well, okay, the breeze does it. The wind does that, right? But notice that the wind is already actual, meaning that something actual has to move upon or work upon the potential, the flag, to move it from its potential state to its actualized state of flapping in the wind, right? But here's the thing. What is making the wind move here and now, right? Well, you can't say, well, the wind is making itself move here and now. That doesn't make any sense. Again, because nothing can actualize itself. Something outside of itself has to act on it to make it to its actual, to actualize it, right? So for instance, the wind is not moving itself. We know that there are certain geothermal events that take place that cause wind patterns, that cause air to move in a certain direction and so forth, right? So there's something that's actual, specifically in this example, geothermal patterns and whatnot, that are causing wind currents, right? Which is causing the flag to move, right? Now, we continue to trace that back. Well, what's causing these geothermal states of affairs to go from not happening at all to happening, right? From some potential state to an actual state. Well, we know it can't be the geothermal events themselves that are actualizing themselves. It has to be something outside of them that actualizes that, right? That makes that begin to happen. Well, we know that it would have to be something actual. Now, you see the problem. This can't go on ad infinitum. Otherwise, nothing will ever be explained, right? We won't have any explanation as to why anything is here existing right now in some sort of state of affairs. So there has to be something that would be pure actuality. This is what's called, again, the philosophy behind this is called pure act. There has to be something that exists in a pure state of act, meaning it's acting upon all other things, but itself is not being moved or changed, right? So think about right now your own existence. Right now, you can't even account for, the existence of, say, you sitting there, right? Something has to be right now holding you in existence. Something has to be taking you from a state of potentially existing, right? Which you were at some point. You didn't exist, but you potentially could exist. Something actual had to bring you into existence, right? Or move you from a potential state of existing to an actual state of existing, right? But here's the thing is that you potentially could not exist either. You can't account for your own existence. You're not actualizing your own existence in the here and in the now. You're not actualizing your own existence. There has to be something that's holding you in existence right here, right now. You may say, well, how is that? I just have existence. No, you're getting existence right now. So think of it this way. What is holding look at your hand, right? What is holding your hand in existence right now? Well, you may say it just is. Well, think about that. Does that make any sense to say that it just is? No. It's depending on your skin, right? Your hand is, at least in some sense, depending upon your skin holding it together from falling, from the bones and the muscle structure and the fissures and tendons and whatever, from just falling out on the floor, right? But your skin is also depending upon something to hold it in existence, right? Say the specific molecules and or the cells, first and foremost, the cells interacting with one another, holding them together to keep your skin there in existence, right? Well, what's doing that? What's holding those cells in existence right now? Well, right now there has to be something that's holding your cells in existence right now, right? To keep them from falling around or whatever. We may say something like, well, the strong and the weak nuclear force is keeping these particular atoms together right now. Well, what's actualizing the strong and the weak nuclear force? Again, even if this, even scientifically found out that there's something actualizing the strong and the weak nuclear forces right now to keep your cells together, to keep atoms together, even if we found out what that was, we could still ask the question about that, right? Well, what's keeping that in existence right now? What's actualizing that right now from a potential state to an actual state? So you see how this doesn't depend on, some scientific finding, because we can continue to ask the question, well, what about that, right? What's moving that from just potentially existing or potentially being there to actually being there or existing, right? And you can't do this, as Aristotle points out, and as later Aquinas would as well, that you can't continue to do this ad infinitum. Otherwise, you have no explanation as to right now why there's anything being actualized or being moved or changed right now. All right. So again, Aquinas' example would be something like this. Think of a song, right? If someone is singing a song, the moment the song only exists simply due to the fact that someone is singing. The moment someone stops singing, then the song itself stops, right? There is no song, right? So right now, the argument would go, if there is no being that is pure act, that is itself pure actuality, then there would be nothing right now holding you in existence as to why you or anything else would exist right here, right now. There'd be no explanation as to why something exists right now, why something is being moved from a potential state of affairs to an actual state of affairs, right? Another example is to think of links on a chain. If we were to try to say, well, this link is being suspended or held in place by this link, which is being held in place by this link, which is being held in place by this link. Well, if there's not an end hook, so to speak, somewhere, well, there's no explanation as to why any of the links at all are still hanging in existence, right? Are still hanging there at all. If there's no link that ends or some hook that ends somewhere that's holding all of them up in some sense, right? There wouldn't be hanging there at all, right? There'd be no explanation as to why they are. Just again, there'd be no explanation as to why the stone is moving if the stick is not moving, if the hand is not moving, which is being moved by the agent, right? That sort of thing. Now, we can also go ahead and derive something from this type of thing that exists, right? So if something exists that must be pure act, otherwise to end this chain of infinite regress, if something must be purely act, right, purely actual, well, then it must be necessary, right? So now we're starting to touch on what we've talked about before about the nature of the attributes of this sort of God if it were to exist. Well, if something exists as purely actualized, right, or as pure act, then it can't be potential in any sort of sense at all, right? It has to be pure act, meaning it must be necessary. Its existence can't not be, right? Because if its existence could not be, well, then that would be a potential state of affairs. But we've already seen that it can't, if there could be some sort of potential state of affairs that it could be, well, then that itself couldn't be the purely actualized actualizer. That thing couldn't itself be the explanation. We would just kick the can back a step, right? So there would have to be something that doesn't have any potential at all. There'd have to be something that exists that has zero potentiality, that can only be pure actuality. Otherwise, we haven't solved the problem. We've just kicked the can back a step, right? So it can't lack power, because if it lacked power, right, or if it lacked some perfection, well, then that would mean that it wasn't, or that would mean that it had some potentiality. But if it has some potentiality, then it can't actualize itself. There would still need to be something that would actualize that particular thing, right? So again, we would just kick the problem back a step. So it can't lack anything at all, right? So when we say, oh, that man is pure, he's got so much potential. We mean that as a compliment. But metaphysically, that's a detriment, because if you lack something, if you have potential, that means you just lack something. But if you lack something, then you can't be necessary, right? Because if you were necessary, then you couldn't lack anything. But if you lack something, then you could be this or you could be that, but you're not necessarily existing, right? I know this is a lot right here to chew off, right? This, again, think about just the ingeniousness, right? If that's even a word. Think about the brilliance, the intellectual prowess of the classical philosophers in the old school of thought there, that they, because of their lack of iPads and whatever else, that their brains have to be on super Megatron power, right, as they go through these types of concepts. So anyway, back to what we were saying, that this existent, this actualized actualizer must be necessary. It can't lack anything whatsoever. Otherwise, it itself wouldn't be the actualizer of all things, because it itself would need an explanation for its existence. In other words, it would need an explanation as to why it could go from some potential state to an actual state, right? And this can't go on ad infinitum. There has to be something that exists necessarily, purely actualized, right, in order for there to be any explanation at all as to why things are actualized now. Now, notice that there could only be one of these infinite unmoved movers. There could be only one of these infinite purely actualized actualizers, right? Well, why could there only be one? Because if there were two infinite beings, right, if there were two purely actualized actualizers, well, then that would mean that there would have to be something in order to distinguish them, right? In order for there to be two, there would have to be something different about them, right? But if there was something different about them so that they could be distinguished one from another, then that would just simply mean that one would have to lack something that the other would lack. Otherwise, there would be no difference between the two, right? Which would just be one. But if there is something that the other lacks, well, then that by definition can't be infinite. It can't be the infinite one, because it lacks something that the other doesn't lack, right? So there couldn't be two perfectly unactualized actualizers, right? There couldn't be two infinite existence, because there would have to be some way to differentiate them, right? But if you could differentiate them, that means that one would lack something that the other doesn't, right? But that means that it itself couldn't be infinite, because it lacks something, right? Now, there's no problem in saying that there may be something that's less than infinite, right? In fact, the Christian worldview, right, the theistic worldview would entail that. It would say that there is something infinite, right, the one true God, but then it would also say there are things that are under that one true God, right, in degrees of power and whatnot, even on down to human beings. But personal agents, even that are not humans, such as angels and demons and whatnot, right? Now, I know that's a lot to chew on, right? I know that's a lot to try and digest in one sitting. So I want you to pause, think about that, go through this particular aspect of the lecture again if you need to. However, having said that, I want us to move on to this teleological argument, right? This version by Aquinas, and I'm going to let you see a video here. That I did a presentation on this at West Georgia, at the University of West Georgia here. Now, this is the Aquinas argument. Again, it's not going to necessarily take any sort of scientific data to utilize this type of argument, right? This is not going to be contingent upon the latest scientific discovery, right? Again, we're following Fazer's lead here. Now, this argument is going to go into more depth about the four causes of all contingent being, the form of matter, but I'm going to let that be spelled out in the actual presentation itself. But I want to go ahead and give you a rundown of what this argument is saying. Basically, this is roughly the argument, right? We could tighten this up here and make it a little more strong if we needed to, but I'd rather you just to be able to understand the gist of the argument. And so it's essentially saying this, that which lacks intelligence and is yet directed towards some end, some goal, some purpose, some telos, hence the teleological argument, then it must be directed towards that end or goal or purpose by an intelligence outside of itself. Now, much of nature lacks intelligence, such as grass, hearts, biological systems within organisms, trees, things with repeatable or predictable patterns, right? So it's not necessarily just biology. Now, it's directed towards some end goal or purpose. We see these things happening over and over and over and over and over again, these repeatable patterns, these end goals, these end purposes, right? So therefore, much of nature is directed towards an end or a goal or a purpose by an intelligence outside of itself. And this intelligence that is outside of itself is just what we mean by God, right? So that's roughly the argument. Hey, look, if something doesn't have intelligence and it's not pointing itself towards some goal, then there has to be something outside of that that's pointing it towards that goal. Otherwise, it's completely random and there really is no goal, right? But the point is that we see things that aren't random. There must be a goal, yet we know that the intelligence is not in that thing in and of itself. So there has to be something directing that thing towards its end goal or its purpose or this repeatable pattern. Now, having said that, let's go ahead and look at this argument here that I want to show you in relation to the teleological argument. Without further ado, let's look at this here.
All right, what we're going to be talking about today, more or less, is the teleological argument. So, before you jump to any presumption about, oh, I already know what the teleological argument is, it concerns this, that, or the other, well, we're actually going to talk about two different versions of that. There's something of a classical version of the teleological argument, somebody like Aquinas would put forth, or Aristotle. But then there's also something of a current or a modern version. When I say modern, we're stretching that, we're using that a little loosely, but something like William Paley's watchmaker argument, or something like current ID theorists, intelligent design. Because what these arguments want to do, the Paley version and the current versions, what they want to look at is that things look designed. So if they look designed, then they must be what? They must be designed. Now, this is where natural selection has come in and offers something of a defeater for this argument, because the argument is that this looks designed, all designs have designers, therefore this must have a designer. Obviously, I've constructed just a very loose syllogism, it's not even valid, but you get the point of that. Something looks designed, it had to have been designed, God designed it. Now, the problem with that, the natural selection argument, all it has to do is offer a defeater to say that, well, yes, this looks designed, but we'll give you a reason as to why this looks designed. Natural selection offers this reason as to why it looks designed, therefore this argument may not necessarily be true. And if you're concerned with just the logical structure of that, well, then that's all it has to do. It just has to offer a possible alternative. Now, we could argue those points, and you can get into that, but we're not going to do that. We're not necessarily concerned with the modern version of that argument. And again, the modern version is, especially the modern, as in intelligent design theorists, what they really want to point out is something called irreducible complexity, or aside from biological functions, or aside from biological forms of life, as if there's another form of life besides biological. They want to look at the cosmological. They want to look at the universe itself. They want to look at the fine-tuning for existence. They want to look at all the combinations, all the factors that come into what makes it possible that human beings are here. Now, again, to just oversimplify their argument, they're going to say something to the effect of, look, the more complex something becomes, the probabilities for that bringing something into existence, or the probability of all of these complex features coming together to provide, say, life to exist, the more you multiply those different aspects, the probability just becomes astronomically idiotic to say that this is a result of chance. Why? Because you're bringing more into the ball game. You're bringing this. You're bringing the gravity. You're bringing the number of atoms within the universe itself. You're bringing the strong and weak nuclear forces, how they have to be tweaked. You're bringing all kinds of information and saying the more that you bring in, the more complex, the probability just starts to get crazy. Let's put it that way. Now, the old version of the teleological argument is not concerned with that. Because remember, science can sometimes, and has in many cases, come along and said, we know that this looks as if it's to be the case in regards to design or what have you, but here's a possible explanation for that. Because the critique of modern intelligent design is that basically many would say that they're trying to appeal to a God of the gaps. This looks very complex, we don't know how this happened, let's fill in the gap of our knowledge with God. That's one of the current critiques. Whether that works there or not, that's up for debate, because again, we're not going to worry necessarily about that argument, but just so that you have some understanding or at least know something of that, there's that argument, or actually, like we said, an oversimplification or a very general use of that. What we want to look at more today is something of the classical version of the teleological argument. We want to look at a version of the argument that would say, I don't care if something looks designed. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I want to look at why things happen over and over and over and over and over and over again to some purpose or to some end or to some goal. Now, of course, you have somebody like David Hume that comes along and says we can't find those things out. That's all inductive. We can't necessarily know what causes constitute what, and so on and so forth. But let's just put that aside for the moment, just to appreciate at least a sampling of this argument. Somebody like Aristotle and Aquinas would say, look, we see things going to some end. So, for instance, if you strike a match, no one is ever worried that when you strike that match, that a bouquet of flowers is going to pop up, or that a commode or a toilet bowl is going to appear in your living room when you strike a match. No one is concerned about that. People know that for the most part, when a match is struck, all things being equal, no crazy winds, no whatever, you're not in a vacuum, that is going to have the end of producing a flame. Now, this version, the classical version of the teleological argument, asks the question, why? Why do we see things in nature, or, to be more specific, in biology, or whatever the case may be, even cosmology, why do we see things going towards these ends over and over and over again? Now, that is a why question. Now, a lot of modern scientists, say Dawkins or even Peter Atkins, they want to say that there's no such thing as why questions. They want to say that there are only how questions, and that why questions are irrelevant and they're ridiculous. Now, you may think that I'm oversimplifying that. No, I'm not. There are scientists that want to say that. There are some that really want to say that. Do all of them? No, that's not the claim. But some do want to say that there's no such thing as a why question. There are only how questions. Obviously, we see that how questions are concerned with how something works. So, for instance, the water's boiling. Why is the water boiling? Well, in that specific mindset, somebody would say, well, really what Russ is asking is not why is that water boiling? They're asking how is it boiling? The temperature is brought up to a certain point. It heats up the molecules, they start to speed up, so on and so forth. How the water is boiling is answered. But we would say no. What if there's another reason as to why is the water boiling? Say I want to boil some hot dogs, or I want to whatever. There's another answer. There's a how question as to how the water's boiling, but there's also a why question as to why that's happening. There's two explanations that work there. Some scientists that are sold out to scientism, which is a philosophical standpoint as opposed to just science itself, want to try and reduce all questions to how. Notice that if they do that, they can never tell you why a pumpkin, as G.K. Chesterton would say, grows from a seed to a pumpkin and not from a seed to a lawn chair or to a barn or what have you. They would have to say at the end of the day, well, it just does. Why does this pumpkin move from this, or this pumpkin seed move from this seed to a pumpkin and not to something else? It just does. It just does. Now, we intuitively recognize that that's not sufficient. That if I were to walk into a room and say, hey, God exists, and someone were to say, why does God exist? Or how do you know that God exists? And I say, he just does. You'd be laughed right back out of the classroom or wherever you may be, and you ought to be laughed out of there because you can't just walk in and say it just does at the end of the day. So this argument, tracing all this back, this argument, the teleological argument, asks the serious question of why does something always move to this particular end? All right, so let's give an example as to just our intuitive sense of why questions being legitimate. Let's say that one of these particular scientists walks in a late night debate. They've been arguing against, let's say, the existence of God with Joe Blow philosopher. They walk home, The debate ends a little early. Gets home and he sees his wife, unfortunately, with some other man. Let's say that he walks in and he wants to know what is going on. Now, is he going to run up to his wife and say, "How are you cheating on me?" When he says, "Why are you doing this?" Does he mean, well, what I really mean is, how are you doing that? Now, we don't need to get into the details of how that's happening. No, what he wants to know is, why are you doing this? And he's not going to accept from his wife or his potential enemy there that there's a legitimate response in saying, "Let me just tell you how I'm doing what I'm doing." No, that's ridiculous. So enough of that. We can move along with that. Back to this particular argument of teleological, or in the teleological argument, things have final causes. Again, I can hear some people almost laughing from the other end of the screen. Oh, efficient causes, material causes, final causes, those formal causes, those things have been debunked for centuries. No, they haven't. There are great arguments to believe that we still have causes that are not just efficient causes or material causes. Why? Because otherwise we have no reason at all. Literally, remember, we just have to say at the end of the day, well, it just does. We have no reason at all to say, if things don't have a formal or a final cause, that when you do X, that Y will be a result. Or vice versa. When you do A, that B will be a result of that. In fact, as Edward Fazer says, you can't even make sense of efficient and material causes unless there are such things as a final cause or an end goal to this particular phenomenon that we're witnessing. Okay, very, very, very quickly. A lot of information here, but just very quickly, oversimplification, 4 causes. Let's take a red solo cup, for example. An efficient cause, a material cause, a formal cause, and a final cause. Now, what is the efficient cause of a red solo cup? Let's say that we see a whole line of these red solo cups on some assembly line somewhere, or you're in some cheap grocery store at 3 a.m. in the morning that you shouldn't be at, and you see a bunch of red solo cups. All right, what is that? What's the cause of that? Well, you have the efficient cause of that. The efficient cause would be the guy, the machines, whatever, that put those solo cups together, that constructed the things. That would be the official cause, or official. That would be the efficient cause, excuse me. The material cause would be what? It would just be the plastic stuff that it's made of. It would just be the material which constitutes the red solo cups sitting there. So you have an efficient cause, you have a material cause. So far, nothing controversial. Everybody agrees with that. Something brought the red solo cups into existence, a bunch of guys or machines. They were made out of something, a material cause, the plastic, whatever they're made of. Now, here's the controversial type stuff that we're getting into, but I think it'll make sense. And again, a lot of information. We're trying to boil it down very quickly. The formal cause of the red solo cup is what? It's the blueprint or the idea or the design of what that solo cup is supposed to be like. So, for instance, if somebody's going to make the red solo cups, they don't just walk over and start just willy-nilly starts moving their hands around in plastic or whatever. They have a design, they have an idea, they have a blueprint in their mind that's the form of what that red solo cup is supposed to be. So you've got the efficient cause. Let's say that I'm doing, I want to make the solo cup. I'm the efficient cause of that. We've got the material cause, the plastic. I have the idea or the form of a red solo cup that makes that what it is. It gives its features, so to speak. And then we would have the final cause. Now, what is the final cause of the cup? What is the end goal of that cup? We could look at it in this sense, in a way of saying purpose. The final cause of that cup is what? To hold a legal beverage. That's the final cause of a red solo cup, is to hold that beverage. There's a purpose to the thing. There's not just the efficient cause, the material cause. There's also a formal cause, and there's a final cause to it. So we see that exemplified in, say, a red solo cup. We see those 4 causes at work there. And we could also, again, oversimplify. But let's say that I want to make a table. I want to make a table. Well, why do I want to make a table? Usually when we ask why, we're usually asking the final cause. Again, going back to the teleos of that thing. We're asking the final cause. Why do I want to make a table? I want to do my homework on the table. I want to sit at the table, whatever. I'm giving you the answer to that question in its why, in its purpose. Well, then the other causes come into play. I am the efficient cause of it. I go make it. I find material cause on the table. I use wood, whatever, metal, whatever they make tables out of now. The form, the idea, the blueprint in my mind that brings that together to be what it is in that sense. It's whatness, what it is. And the final cause, we already mentioned, the purpose of the thing. So very quickly, a lot of information there, but that's going to give you a quick overview of the four causes of Aristotle and Aquinas. So, in regards to the universe, in regards to people, to biological life, so to speak, in regards to anything that we see, where we see causal patterns or causal regularities, we can say, now some of these we can be confused on. That's not the argument. You can be confused on some of these, no problem. But if there are any that we can say, when A is done, B will be a result. In fact, if you want to argue that we can't know that, then you've just flushed science down the toilet. Because science is concerned with what? Reproducing experiments in the laboratory, doing this particular thing so that this will result. And if this does that enough times, then we supposedly have made a leap forward in our knowledge of some particular problem, whatever it may be, the particular hypothesis that is being worked on there. You do this, this will be a result. Now again, that can only be explained if you can count on the fact that there will be that result every single time, considering all the circumstances are equal. Why? Because there's a gearing towards that end. There's a gearing towards that goal or that final cause that it's going towards. Now, Aquinas would say the argument like this. He would say, now, if an arrow is going through the air and it's going towards some particular goal, say the target, but the intelligence is not in the arrow itself, then why is it going towards that target repeatedly? He'd say because there's an intelligence outside of that moving it towards that goal, which would be what? Which would be the archer. The archer shoots the arrow constantly is going towards that particular goal, the target, but the intelligence is not in the arrow, but it's moving towards a goal as if it has purpose and function. He would say, right, because the archer is directing that towards that end or that purpose. Now, obviously, if we can't connect the parallel there, we'll try to help you here. Here we go. If things are going towards ends or purposes, they're going towards a goal. Grass always has this particular goal. Acorns always have this particular goal. Rocks, when they fall, have this particular goal because of gravity and so on and so forth. If we can see these causal regularities, are you satisfied with saying, why does that happen? It just does. No reason, no rhyme or reason to it at all. Or is it more plausible to say, because if we see something going towards a goal repeatedly, on a regular basis, just as if we were to see an arrow driving or going towards its end goal in the target, there's an intelligence that would drive that or direct that towards its final end, its final goal. Otherwise, at the end of the day, remember, you have to toss out science. You have to flush science because you can't really say that will continue to do that. It just happened to at that point in time. So anyway, there's a very brief overview of the intelligent design particular argument, that teleological argument, with the more classic and the one that I feel is more persuasive, especially if we have the time to go through the details of that argument. Hopefully that gives you a flavor of both of those arguments and it can open up for some discussion there.
All right, guys. So there you have something like the classical version of our teleological argument. And you see how this is staunchly different, right, than the modern version of the teleological argument, as explained in the video there, that the modern version is really more concerned with probability, right? All of these probabilities about how things are ordered, the fine-tuning and whatnot. This has to do with the cause and effect relationship between things and regularities, natures and essences, and things directed towards real goals, real purposes. Now, one of the things is mentioned in the video there that I stated was that is it more plausible to say that things aren't truly, that's an important point, is it more plausible to say that things aren't truly going towards specific ends because they have real purposes than it is to deny that things just happen to be doing those sorts of things on a regular basis? Which is more plausible? And that is the point of the teleological argument, is that if something really is going towards these end goals and purposes, and the intelligence is not within the thing itself, yet it's going towards an end goal or a purpose, just as an arrow goes to a target, then there has to be some sort of intelligence that's driving it towards that end goal or purpose, right? Now, I know, excuse me, I've got springtime here, and so I'm being devastated by Peter pollen. Now, I know this is a lot to think about in this particular lecture, right? We've got two seriously robust and deep, abstract, somewhat difficult to grasp arguments. I don't think the teleological argument is necessarily that hard to grasp, but I do think that the first really is. So this may be something that you want to go back over, listen to again while you're working out, walking, driving in your vehicle, whatever it is that you may be doing, where you can find some extra time there. And just go back over it again. Think about it, right? This may be something interesting to do in your discussion posts, to do a little extra research on your own if you want to do that, to look a little more, in depth at the first argument there, that first Aristotelian version of a cosmological argument there. Now, that's not to say, and let me just say this by way of our exit here, that's not to say that's the only Aristotelian version of a cosmological argument. There's a couple of them. Few of them, contingency type arguments. That argument that we mentioned, that's not the only one that Aristotle had at his disposal, nor Aquinas. Had a couple different versions. But I want to get you introduced to some of these classical arguments and leave the more popular versions in the philosophy of religion just to your apologetics types course. I want to get you some of the old school, the classic stuff here, introduce you to that. So having said that, I hope to see you next lecture, next class. Today we'll conclude our Aristotelian and our teleological argument, and next class we'll look more in depth at some other arguments, right, that are classical, that are old school, so to speak, in the philosophy of religion. So having said that, be safe until next